Lily Hart had spent years trying to rebuild her life after leaving Victor Romano, the man she once loved and feared in equal measure. At the time of their marriage, Victor had been more than just a powerful mafia boss, he was a force that commanded respect and terror in every corner of the city. The glint of his tailored suits, the sharpness in his gaze, and the quiet authority in his voice had drawn her in like a moth to a flame. She had been young, full of dreams, and utterly captivated by the idea that love could exist even in a world as dangerous and chaotic as his. But that love, as intoxicating as it was, came with a price. Long nights spent alone in their massive penthouse, whispers of danger in the streets below, and the constant tension of knowing he lived a life she could never fully be part of eventually broke her spirit. Lily had walked away, leaving behind the security, the wealth, and the man she still, deep down, loved. For years, she had convinced herself that life could be simpler without him. She moved into a small apartment in the quieter side of the city, took a modest job at a boutique, and surrounded herself with friends who reminded her that the world was bigger than fear and shadows. She learned to smile again, to make small plans, and to enjoy mornings that weren't clouded by tension or suspicion. She filled her life with little joys, a cup of coffee at the corner cafe, evening walks along the river, books that made her laugh or cry, and occasional dinners with her friends Grace and Ava, who had stood by her through heartbreak and disappointment. Lily had begun to believe that she had finally escaped the pull of Victor Romano, that his memory was something she could tuck away neatly like an old photograph. But hope, as it often does, has a way of creeping back when least expected. It happened one evening at a charity gala organized by Grace, who had insisted that Lily attend. Lily had initially resisted, telling herself that such events were frivolous, loud, and full of people who existed only to show off. But Grace had insisted, promising that it would be a chance to celebrate life, to be reminded that the world still had beauty. With a mixture of reluctance and curiosity, Lily agreed. She dressed in a simple yet elegant navy blue gown, letting her hair fall loosely over her shoulders. She walked into the grand ballroom, the soft golden lights reflecting off crystal chandeliers, the scent of roses and polished wood filling the air. She smiled politely at acquaintances, exchanged pleasantries, and tried to enjoy the music that floated like a gentle river through the room. And then, as if the universe had conspired to test her, she saw him. Victor Romano. He stood across the room, tall and commanding, dressed in a sharp black tuxedo that seemed to absorb the light around him. His presence was immediate, undeniable. He was older, of course, years of power and stress etched into the lines of his face, but there was no mistaking him. Those same piercing eyes that had haunted her dreams for years now softened slightly when they landed on her. Lily felt a jolt, a rush of emotions she hadn't experienced in years, surprise, longing, fear, and an unspoken recognition that some bonds, no matter how broken, never truly fade. Victor approached, his movements calm and deliberate, exuding the quiet confidence that had always both terrified and enthralled her. "Lily," he said, his voice a low, smooth rumble that still made her heart skip. "I didn't expect to see you here." There was no anger, no accusation, just a hint of surprise that seemed almost vulnerable, a side of him she hadn't seen in years. Lily forced herself to smile, feeling a strange mixture of tension and excitement. "Neither did I," she replied softly, her voice steady even as her hands trembled slightly. They began to talk, at first cautiously, exchanging small, polite sentences about mutual friends and life events, but soon the conversation deepened. They reminisced about shared memories, some bittersweet, some that brought genuine laughter. The old chemistry was undeniable, lingering in the space between their words, in the way their eyes met, in the subtle brush of hands when passing a drink or a folder of charity documents. Lily realized that no matter how much time had passed, a connection remained, something neither distance nor heartbreak could completely erase. For the first time in years, a small spark of hope flickered in her heart, fragile but insistent, like a candle flickering in the darkness. As the evening drew on, Victor leaned closer, his voice dropping to a level so intimate that it sent shivers down her spine. "Would you like to get some fresh air?" he asked, his tone gentle, careful, almost hesitant. Lily hesitated, memories of their past flashing in her mind, the arguments, the fear, the nights spent crying alone. Yet there was something in his eyes now, something soft and unthreatening, that made her trust him in a way she hadn't allowed herself in years. "Okay," she whispered, letting him guide her to the terrace outside. The night was cool, the city lights twinkling below like scattered stars. The sound of traffic was distant, almost irrelevant, and for a moment, the world felt suspended in time. They stood side by side, silent at first, simply observing the city, letting memories wash over them. And then, slowly, as the night deepened, they began to speak of things they had never dared to before, regrets, lost opportunities, the loneliness they had both endured. Victor's voice softened with emotion, a rare vulnerability that made Lily's chest ache. She felt herself opening up too, sharing thoughts and feelings she had buried deep inside. It was a conversation that was less about rekindling romance and more about understanding, closure, and a delicate rediscovery of trust. By the time they returned to the ballroom, rain had begun to fall gently, coating the streets in a shimmering reflection of the city lights. Victor offered her his coat, and she accepted, feeling the warmth of his presence against the chill. That night, for the first time in a long time, Lily felt hope. It was not loud or dramatic, it did not come with promises or declarations. It was quiet, steady, and deeply human, the kind of hope that seeps into your bones, reminding you that even after pain and loss, life still holds moments of unexpected beauty, connection, and the possibility of something more. Little did she know, that small spark of hope was about to ignite into a fire that would challenge everything she thought she knew about love, trust, and destiny. Lily's fragile hope came crashing down weeks later, in a moment that changed everything she thought she had under control. At first, she tried to dismiss the signs, telling herself it was impossible, that the world had not conspired to drag her back into Victor Romano's dangerous orbit. But the moment she held the small, stark pregnancy test in her hands, reality hit her like a tidal wave. She was pregnant, and there was no denying it. The truth echoed in her mind relentlessly, as if screaming from every corner of her apartment, Victor's child. The word permanently lingered, not just as a biological certainty but as a permanent shift in her life, one she hadn't anticipated and wasn't sure she wanted. Her heart raced, her chest tightened, and for a long moment, she could only sit on the edge of her bed, staring at the floor, wondering how a single night could unravel everything she had worked so hard to protect. Memories of that night with Victor, the tender glances, the soft touches, the warmth of being close to him, suddenly felt like both a blessing and a curse. She had allowed herself to hope, to believe that perhaps reconnecting with him had been harmless, that it had been an innocent attempt to find closure or understanding. And now she had no choice but to face the consequences of that fleeting closeness. Panic and fear gripped her, not just for herself, but for the life growing inside her. She thought of the dangers that always seemed to follow Victor, of the men and enemies who lurked in the shadows, of the violence and secrecy that had defined his existence for so many years. She realized that her unborn child could never simply exist in a normal, safe world. When Victor finally learned of the pregnancy, he did not react the way Lily had expected. There was no fury, no anger, no demands or threats. Instead, his face went pale, his usual control slipping like sand through his fingers, leaving only stunned disbelief and a kind of raw, unfiltered fear that was foreign to anyone who knew him. He stared at her, eyes wide and unblinking, as if trying to convince himself that the truth could somehow vanish if he looked at it hard enough. "Lily, this isn't possible," he whispered, though the tremor in his voice betrayed the lie. She felt a pang of sadness at the sight of him, the man who had once ruled empires and feared no one, now reduced to a human being confronted with the unexpected consequences of his own choices. For Lily, seeing him like this was both painful and strangely comforting. It reminded her that behind the facade of power and control, he was still just a man, capable of fear, regret, and, perhaps, even love. Yet the knowledge did little to ease her own turmoil. Every day, she felt a mixture of excitement and terror as her body changed, as she carried a living reminder of the night she had allowed herself to believe in a fleeting connection. Pain seeped into every part of her life, sharper and deeper than she had anticipated. Friends tried to console her, offering advice and support, but Lily could not shake the feeling that she was caught in a storm that no one else could navigate for her. She thought constantly of what this pregnancy meant. Not just for her future, but for the future of a child who would bear the legacy of Victor Romano. She thought of the whispers in the streets, the danger that always seemed to trail his footsteps, and the way her heart still leapt when she remembered the softness in his eyes that night. It was a paradoxical mixture of love and fear, hope and dread, all wrapped together into a single, unyielding reality. She questioned every choice she had made, every moment she had spent letting her guard down, and every second she had allowed herself to hope that Victor could be different than the man she had known. And yet, even in her pain, there was a quiet, stubborn glimmer of something else, something that whispered she could survive this, that she could protect the child, and that somehow, life had a way of balancing the chaos with moments of unexpected grace. Victor, meanwhile, was left in a state of relentless turmoil. The man who had never flinched in the face of danger now found himself staring at a future he had never imagined. He walked the penthouse late at night, pacing like a caged animal, replaying every memory of his life with Lily in painful clarity. The regret of losing her once came back with crushing intensity, mingled with fear for what lay ahead. For the first time, he began to understand the true weight of responsibility, not just for the empire he had built, but for the life that now existed because of him. He called Ava repeatedly, seeking advice, seeking comfort, yet finding only partial solace in her calm pragmatism. Every conversation with her reminded him that the man who had once ruled through fear would now have to navigate the world through love, protection, and care, a concept that seemed alien and terrifying to him. The shock of the pregnancy had stripped him bare, leaving nothing but a man forced to confront the consequences of passion and power intertwined. As the days turned into weeks, the emotional burden on both Lily and Victor became increasingly heavy. Every interaction between them was charged with unspoken tension, every glance fraught with the knowledge of what could never be undone. Lily found herself crying in the quiet of her apartment, mourning both the life she thought she had reclaimed and the life she was about to create. Victor, in turn, wrestled with sleepless nights and racing thoughts, trying to imagine a future that included responsibility, love, and vulnerability, concepts that had once seemed like weaknesses in his world. Their lives, once separate and carefully contained, were now bound together by something deeper, irrevocable, and infinitely complicated. The pain of this new reality was relentless, yet in its sharp edges, there was also the beginning of understanding, a quiet, slow recognition that life, in its unpredictable cruelty and beauty, had given them both a chance to confront the past and perhaps, in time, to forge something neither had dared hope for. Victor Romano's world had always been defined by power, control, and precision. Yet the revelation of Lily's pregnancy shattered every carefully constructed layer of his life, leaving him raw and exposed in ways he had never anticipated. For weeks, he wandered through the penthouse and the sprawling city that bore his name, haunted by thoughts that refused to be silenced. Every decision he had ever made, the alliances, the deals, the fear he commanded, suddenly seemed hollow compared to the gravity of what he had created that night with Lily. The realization struck him like a lightning bolt. He was no longer simply a man who ruled from shadows and whispers. He was about to become a father, and nothing in his violent, meticulously controlled world had prepared him for this responsibility. He began to see Lily not as an ex-wife, a fleeting passion, or a complicated memory, but as the mother of his child, a living connection that demanded more than words, more than power, and more than control. The enormity of it consumed him, leaving him restless and haunted. He couldn't sleep. He couldn't eat. Every reflection in the mirror seemed to show the truth he had long denied, that love and consequence were inseparable, that life had a way of confronting even the most untouchable men with accountability, and that there was no escaping the chains of one's own choices. Ava, his closest advisor and the one person who dared speak to him without fear, noticed the change immediately. The once cold, impenetrable boss was suddenly haunted, distracted, and vulnerable. When she asked him what was wrong, Victor could not form a coherent sentence. He could only stare into the distance, imagining the child he had never planned for, wondering if he could ever be worthy of the life now tied irrevocably to him. The revelation forced Victor to confront truths about himself that he had avoided for decades. He began to recall his past mistakes with painfully sharp clarity, the nights he had abandoned Lily to protect his empire, the cold indifference he had shown when she cried silently in their bedroom, the fear he had inspired in her when he had allowed the world to define their love instead of choosing them. Each memory cut him deeper than any rival's blade ever could, and he realized that the life he had built, luxurious, feared, untouchable, was nothing without human connection, without love, and without responsibility. For the first time, he began to understand that power alone could never protect what mattered most, it could only destroy it if wielded carelessly. He sought out old photographs of Lily, small mementos of their time together, and held them to his chest, feeling a bittersweet ache that left him both broken and determined. The revelation was no longer just about the pregnancy, it was about the man he wanted to be, the father he needed to become, and the chance to finally right a lifetime of wrongs before it was too late. When he finally approached Lily, it was not with threats, demands, or the authority that had once defined every interaction between them. It was with humility, with a trembling voice, and with an honesty so stark that it left Lily momentarily speechless. He admitted everything, his regrets, his failures, his fear of losing her again, and his desire to protect the life growing inside her at all costs. He spoke not as a mafia boss, but as a man stripped bare, revealing vulnerability that few had ever witnessed. Lily, who had spent weeks navigating her own fears and uncertainties, felt a mixture of emotions she had never expected, anger, relief, disbelief, and, deep within her chest, a flicker of hope she thought had been extinguished. She listened as Victor confessed not just love, but accountability, showing her the man he could become if he allowed himself to change. Every word he spoke carried weight, sincerity, and an unspoken promise that the mistakes of the past would not define their future. The city outside seemed to pause as they stood there, facing each other, two hearts battered by time, circumstance, and loss, yet connected more deeply than ever before. Victor's revelation was not merely verbal, it was evident in the small, tender gestures, the way he reached for her hand without demanding it, the softness in his eyes that had never existed before, the careful, deliberate respect for her boundaries. Lily realized that this child, though unexpected, was forcing both of them into a new reality, a reality where honesty, vulnerability, and love could no longer be optional. The revelation extended beyond the personal, it reshaped the very essence of their relationship. For the first time, they were not defined by past pain or power struggles but by the possibility of redemption and transformation. Every conversation, every shared silence, became a step toward understanding the magnitude of what was happening. Victor began making small but significant changes in his life, removing himself from the networks of fear he had once ruled, quietly examining what it meant to protect rather than dominate. In those days, Victor and Lily discovered something neither had expected, that revelation, though painful and terrifying, could also be a catalyst for growth. They began to communicate not just through words, but through shared understanding, glances, and the unspoken acknowledgement of responsibility that now bound them together. Victor's fear did not dissipate, but it became purposeful, it fueled his desire to be better, to be a father, and to ensure that the life he had helped create would be protected from the shadows he had once inhabited so recklessly. Lily, in turn, saw a side of Victor she had never dared to hope for, a man capable of reflection, remorse, and change. She realized that the revelation was not just about the child, it was about uncovering the truth of who Victor could become when faced with undeniable responsibility and the purest form of consequence. The days grew heavier with emotion, but in the weight of truth, there was clarity. Pain and fear lingered, but they were accompanied by the quiet understanding that sometimes, revelation is the first step toward redemption, and that the heart, even when bruised, has an extraordinary capacity to hope again. Victor Romano's journey toward redemption was neither simple nor immediate, it was a path carved out of fear, regret, and a desperate determination to become the man his child deserved him to be. The revelation of Lily's pregnancy had shattered the walls he had spent decades building, and for the first time in his life, he realized that power alone could never shield anyone from the consequences of his choices. He began with small, deliberate steps, quietly dismantling portions of the criminal empire that had once defined him, transferring influence to people he could trust, and cutting ties with dangerous associates who had long profited from fear and intimidation. Every decision felt like walking on a tightrope, balancing the necessity of survival against the moral imperative to protect the life growing inside Lily. He consulted with Ava late into the nights, discussing legal avenues, safe transitions, and ways to untangle himself from the violence that had always surrounded him. Unlike the ruthless, cold strategist he had once been, Victor now approached every move with caution, empathy, and the awareness that the smallest misstep could destroy the fragile trust he was trying to rebuild with Lily. This transformation did not go unnoticed by the city or those who had long observed his empire. Whispers began circulating about the boss who was changing, stepping back from the shadows, and slowly relinquishing the fear he had once commanded so effortlessly. But Victor cared little for rumors or appearances now. His focus was singular, to become a man worthy of his child, and a partner whom Lily could trust. For Lily, watching Victor's transformation was both painful and awe-inspiring. She had spent years believing that he was unchangeable, that the man she had loved and feared was incapable of tenderness outside fleeting, intense moments. And yet, every time he arrived at her apartment unannounced, offering help with groceries, doctor visits, or simple support, she could see the new version of him taking shape, a version guided by conscience and care rather than ambition and control. Their conversations became longer, deeper, and tinged with honesty they had never dared before. He spoke of his fears, the nights he had spent replaying mistakes, and the determination to protect them both from a life dictated by his past. Lily began to realize that redemption was not a single act or declaration but a continuous choice, one that Victor was making every day, often silently, often at great personal cost. The man who had once terrified her now terrified her in a different way, not with power, but with the intensity of his commitment to change. As the pregnancy progressed, Victor's efforts became more tangible. He worked to create a stable environment for the child, renting a modest, secure home away from the dangerous streets he once ruled, and arranging legal guardianship and protection measures to ensure Lily and the baby would be safe. He made amends where he could, reaching out to people he had wronged, offering restitution and apologies, and dismantling alliances built on intimidation rather than trust. Each act, however small, was a testament to his willingness to embrace vulnerability and accountability. He even sought professional counseling to address his own patterns of control and detachment, a humbling step that shocked even those closest to him. Meanwhile, Lily observed quietly, her emotions a tangled mix of skepticism, cautious hope, and growing admiration. She had long ago stopped expecting the impossible from Victor, yet she could not ignore the changes manifesting in both his actions and his demeanor. She began to see a man who was not perfect, but profoundly committed, a man who had chosen the arduous path of integrity for the sake of someone else. The weeks leading up to the birth were intense. Victor rarely left her side, attending every doctor's appointment, reading books about parenting, and even learning about nutrition and care in a way that was endearing yet painfully real. Their interactions, once charged with history and tension, now held a subtle warmth and mutual respect, a recognition that they were no longer the same people who had hurt each other so deeply. Victor had traded control for presence, ambition for empathy, and fear for love, a transformation as raw and difficult as the labor Lily would soon endure. Grace and Ava watched from the sidelines, often marveling at the radical change in the man who had once been untouchable, offering quiet support to Lily as she navigated the emotional roller coaster of pregnancy and the impending arrival of a child who would forever alter their lives. Finally, the day came when Lily went into labor, and Victor, for all his experience with danger, found himself powerless before the natural force of life he had once only observed from a distance. In the hospital room, the tension was unbearable, yet beneath it lay a current of hope and anticipation. Victor held her hand through every contraction, whispering encouragement, apologies, and promises of protection, each word weighted with sincerity and a vulnerability that left Lily both emotional and awed. When their child was finally born, the room filled with the soft, miraculous sound of new life, and Victor, tears streaming down his face, held the baby with a reverence he had never shown to any empire or fortune. In that moment, redemption was no longer an abstract concept, it was tangible, alive, and irrevocable. Victor Romano, the man who had once ruled through fear and power, had finally chosen to love selflessly, to protect without expectation, and to embrace the responsibilities that true redemption demanded. Lily, witnessing this transformation firsthand, felt a deep sense of peace and cautious joy. The path had been long, painful, and fraught with uncertainty, but through it, both of them had discovered that change is possible, even for those who seem unchangeable, and that love, when paired with responsibility, has the power to redeem even the most troubled souls. The birth of their child marked not just a new beginning, but a profound transformation for both Victor Romano and Lily Hart, a moment that redefined their lives in ways neither could have anticipated. The tiny life cradled in Victor's arms was more than a baby, it was a symbol of hope, forgiveness, and the possibility of a future untainted by fear and regret. In the quiet of the hospital room, with the soft hum of machines and the muted footsteps of nurses in the hall, Victor allowed himself to feel something he had never permitted in decades: pure, unguarded love. He gazed down at the child's delicate features, the tiny fingers curling instinctively around his own, and felt a surge of emotions: relief, wonder, awe, and an overwhelming sense of responsibility that made every past mistake ache in his chest. He looked at Lily, who sat exhausted yet radiant, holding her newborn close, and in her eyes, he saw a reflection of the same mixture of pain, hope, and resilience that had always drawn him to her. In that moment, all the years of fear, anger, and heartbreak seemed to converge into a single, powerful truth: redemption is not measured by wealth, power, or reputation, but by the courage to protect, nurture, and love unconditionally. Life outside the hospital gradually resumed its rhythm, but for Victor and Lily, nothing was ever quite the same. The city that had once been ruled by his fearsome reputation now witnessed a man quietly remaking his legacy, not through intimidation or control, but through commitment and care. He took up legitimate business ventures, investing time and resources into ventures that could support his family without resorting to the shadows that had previously defined him. Lily, who had once feared his power and its consequences, now saw him navigate parenthood and responsibility with a humility and patience that seemed almost foreign compared to the man she had known. Together, they forged routines that balanced their shared responsibilities, laughter, and even the occasional playful argument, grounding their new family life in moments of normalcy they had both once thought impossible. Grace and Ava became integral to this new chapter, helping with childcare, offering counsel, and witnessing the extraordinary changes in both Lily and Victor as they grew into their roles as parents. Friends and family, once wary of the notorious Mafia boss, began to see glimpses of the man he had always had the potential to be: strong, protective, but infinitely human. The child became a bridge between the past and the future, a living reminder that even amidst pain and chaos, hope could take root and flourish. Lily watched as Victor sang lullabies in his deep, unshakable voice, as he held the baby through long nights, and as he made countless small sacrifices that spoke louder than any promise. She realized that love, true love, is often quiet, steady, and measured in actions rather than words, and that Victor had embraced this truth fully. In turn, Victor learned that redemption is not about erasing the past but transforming it, allowing mistakes to serve as lessons rather than shackles. Each day with his family strengthened him, reshaping his priorities and softening the edges that had once been honed by fear and power. He learned patience, empathy, and the profound joy of being present for someone entirely dependent on him, discovering that the vulnerability he had once avoided was, paradoxically, the source of his greatest strength. Months passed, and the house that Victor had prepared for his new family became a sanctuary, filled with laughter, the soft hum of daily life, and the comforting presence of people who loved them. The child grew healthy and curious, their small hands reaching for the world with fearless innocence, while Victor and Lily learned to navigate parenthood with a balance of discipline, affection, and gentle guidance. They celebrated birthdays, holidays, and quiet evenings with a sense of gratitude that had been absent from both of their lives for far too long. In these moments, the lessons of their past, pain, regret, and the weight of secrets, transformed into moral warmth, the kind that seeps into hearts and homes, leaving behind a legacy of hope and love. Even the city, which had long associated Victor Romano with fear, began to notice subtle changes, charitable contributions, support for local families, and a presence that spoke not of dominance, but of care and responsibility. In the end, Lily understood that their journey, with all its turbulence, fear, and heartbreak, had led them to a place far richer than either could have imagined. She saw in Victor a man who had confronted his flaws, embraced accountability, and chosen love over power. She saw in their child a future unburdened by fear, a life that represented the best of both of them. And she felt, with a quiet, profound certainty, that redemption is not an abstract ideal but a living, breathing reality, nurtured by patience, compassion, and unwavering commitment. As Victor held her hand and kissed her forehead one evening, with their child asleep between them, she realized that moral warmth, the gentle, sustaining power of love, forgiveness, and responsibility, was the greatest legacy anyone could leave. And for the first time in a long time, she believed completely that hope, no matter how fragile it seemed, could endure forever.